This video exists because of you. We put a question to the Movie Blanket Club community. Which national horror cinema should we cover next? Russian, French, or Spanish? You voted, and Russia won. So here we are. Russian horror has a lineage unlike any other, rooted in folklore as old as the land itself, shaped by Soviet Gothic, and defined by a particular dread that no other national cinema quite replicates. These are our picks for the top 20 best Russian horror movies of all time ranked. Let us count them down. Number 20, directed by Anton Bormatov. Syndrome, 2023. This recent entry opens the countdown as evidence that Russian horror is still producing new voices, willing to work in the mode of psychological dread rather than conventional spectacle. A contemporary horror that operates from the inside out, less interested in external threat than in the deterioration of a protagonist's grip on what is real. Syndrome achieves more atmosphere than its modest resources might suggest. The production works within the constraints that contemporary Russian genre cinema regularly imposes on itself, and finds within those constraints a film that is more disciplined than its position at the foot of this list implies. Its weaknesses are genuine. The structure is not always as tight as its ambition requires, and certain tonal inconsistencies in the middle section undermine tension that the film has carefully accumulated. But its central conceit is handled with conviction, and the dread it generates is the quiet, persistent kind, the sort that stays longer than the film itself. Your votes placed it here, and the placement is fair without being dismissive. In our view, Syndrome belongs in this conversation as a recent contribution to a tradition that rewards patience and punishes expectations shaped by Western horror conventions. Number 19, directed by Oleg Asadulin. Phobos, Fear Club, Phobos. Klub Stracha, 2010. The premise is familiar from Western horror. A group of young people locked in a confined space with something that wants them dead. In this case, the setting is a decommissioned Soviet nuclear bunker beneath Moscow, a choice that transforms the familiar setup into something with genuine specificity and weight. A social gathering turns to horror when the exits seal and the group discovers that their fears, in this environment, are not metaphorical. Asadulin directs with a competence that the film's budget does not always permit him to fully realize, and the ensemble cast, playing characters more differentiated than the genre typically allows, commits to the escalating terror with a conviction that holds even when the plotting becomes erratic. The film's use of Soviet architecture as horror environment is its most interesting contribution. There is something about those particular spaces, their scale, their reinforcement, their designed imperviousness to the outside world, that the film exploits with genuine intelligence. The weaknesses are those of a production navigating commercial expectations and genre conventions simultaneously, without always finding a clean line between them. In our view, Phobos earns its place here as the best Russian entry in the bunker horror subgenre. Number 18, directed by Evgeny Puzyrevsky. The X, Bivsha, 2021. A psychological horror that operates in the territory between domestic threat and supernatural dread. The space where the genre is most effective when it trusts the audience to hold both registers simultaneously. The film follows a young couple whose lives are disrupted by the return of a figure from the past. An ex whose presence begins to unspool the boundaries between what is real, what is remembered, and what the mind constructs to protect itself from what it cannot explain. Russian horror of the contemporary period has shown a consistent interest in the uncanny domestic, the horror that lives inside ordinary spaces and ordinary relationships. And the X works most effectively when it trusts that instinct. Its weaknesses lie in a third act that resolves more cleanly than the preceding tension earns, and in a central dynamic that the screenplay does not develop as fully as the premise requires. But the atmosphere is genuine, and the performance at the film's center carries it through its less certain passages with enough conviction to hold. Your votes placed it at 18, and in our view, That is a fair assessment of a film that does more right than it does wrong. Number 17, directed by Alexander Strizhanov. Yulenka, 2009. The malevolent child subgenre has a distinguished international lineage, and Strizhanov's film earns its place within it by grounding its horror in a recognizable social reality. The vulnerability of the recently widowed, the fragility of new domestic arrangements, and the specific blindness of a man who cannot see what is directly in front of him. A widower falls in love and remarries, acquiring a stepdaughter, Yulenka, who is polite, quiet, and methodically destroying everything around her. The film has the patience of a slow-burn thriller and the instincts of a horror film, and it manages both without entirely satisfying either, a tension that is the source of both its strengths and its frustrations. The child performance at its center is the film's most significant achievement, controlled, unsettling, and never permitted to tip into the theatrical excess that the genre tempts. Strizhanov understands that the most frightening thing a child can do in a horror film is nothing, and the restraint he and his young lead maintain across the film's runtime is more effective than any conventional scare mechanism the screenplay might have substituted. In our view, Yulenka earns its place on this list without argument. Number 16, directed by Grigory Konstantinopolsky. The Envelope, Convert, 2017. Konstantinopolsky is one of the more idiosyncratic directors working in Russian genre cinema, and The Envelope reflects both his strengths and his limitations in equal measure. A seemingly ordinary envelope arrives and sets in motion a sequence of events that cannot be undone, a premise the film uses to explore the terror of consequences, the things we do without understanding what we are setting in motion, and the things done to us by forces that pre-existed our awareness of them. The film operates in a register closer to the uncanny than to conventional horror. It does not rely on shock, which is a choice as much as a limitation, and the atmosphere it builds is slow, cerebral, and occasionally alienating by design. Its weaknesses are those of a director more interested in ideas than in mechanics. The second half loses the tautness the first half establishes, and certain narrative choices prioritize conceptual coherence over dramatic satisfaction. But Konstantinopolsky's intelligence is present in every scene, and the film rewards the patience it demands. In our view, The Envelope belongs here as the most cerebral entry on this list, the one least likely to frighten and most likely to unsettle in ways that take longer to name. Number 15, directed by Igor Baranov. The Outpost, Avantpost, 2019. Baranov's science fiction horror operates in the tradition of the Soviet fantastica, stories in which anomalous zones, altered realities, and forces beyond human comprehension are treated not as fantasy elements, but as problems to be approached with the same seriousness one would bring to any other form of threat. A series of inexplicable disappearances around a specific geographic boundary draws a military investigation unit into contact with something that the language of conventional threat assessment cannot adequately describe. The film's ambitions exceed what its budget can fully support. The visual effects work is variable, and certain action sequences reveal their constraints more openly than the film can sustain. But Baranov's direction is assured. The atmosphere of creeping wrongness is sustained with genuine craft, and the questions the film raises about the nature of the boundary between the known and the unknown are handled with more intellectual seriousness than the genre typically attempts. Baranov's second appearance on this list demonstrates a filmmaker with a consistent command of the genre's deeper registers. In our view, The Outpost is a worthy successor to the tradition it inherits, and the community was right to include it. Number 14, directed by Sviatoslav Podgayevsky. Mermaid, The Lake of the Dead, Rusalka. Озеро мертвых, 2018. Podgayevsky, who appears on this list more than any other director, here adapts one of the oldest figures in Slavic horror tradition, the Rusalka, the spirit of a drowned woman who claims the living. A young man returns from a summer retreat changed in ways his loved ones cannot identify, and the film follows the consequences of his encounter through the eyes of those who love him and cannot understand what they are dealing with. The film is the most purely folkloric entry in Podgaevsky's filmography, and that grounding gives it a specificity that his more generic works sometimes lack. The Rusalka is a genuinely Russian kind of horror, rooted in a specific relationship between the living and bodies of water, and the film knows why that matters. Its weaknesses are those of a commercially oriented production. The romantic subplot is underdeveloped, certain narrative shortcuts are visible, and the climax resolves more abruptly than the atmospheric first two acts deserve. But as a folkloric horror film with genuine cultural roots, Mermaid, The Lake of the Dead, earns its position. In our view, it is the most specifically Russian supernatural film Podgaevsky has made. Number 13. Directed by Oleg Stepchenko. V. 2014. Stepchenko's remake of the 1967 Soviet classic, repositioned in the early 18th century, with an English cartographer played by Jason Fleming, arriving in a Ukrainian village and encountering the supernatural events surrounding the local church, is a more ambitious and more interesting production than its critical reception suggested. The decision to add a Western protagonist allows the film to approach Gogol's source material from the perspective of a rationalist confronting a world that his rationalism cannot accommodate, which is a legitimate interpretive choice that the original did not require, and the remake earns. The special effects work, among the most technically ambitious in Russian cinema at the time of production, has dated in ways that were inevitable. The film's hybrid international production creates tonal inconsistencies that Stepchenko does not entirely resolve. But the core of Gogol's story, the seminarian, the witch, the night vigil, the Vi itself, is handled with genuine respect for the original, and the atmosphere of a Ukrainian village at the edge of a known world is achieved with a visual intelligence the film's detractors consistently undervalued. In our view, Stepchenko's Vi deserves a more generous reassessment than the one it received. Number 12. Directed by Denis Naymond. Tin, Gest, 2006. The most viscerally uncomfortable film in the lower half of this list, and the one that most directly confronts the bleakness of post-Soviet Russian urban reality as a horror context in its own right. A young woman photographer documenting the margins of the city finds herself drawn into the orbit of a serial killer, and the film refuses to aestheticize either the violence or the environment in which it takes place. Ney's works in a register closer to psychological thriller than supernatural horror, but the terror the film generates is genuine and sustained, rooted in the specific texture of the spaces it inhabits. Stairwells, empty lots, apartments that feel simultaneously inhabited and abandoned. The film has been criticized for the grimness of its vision, a criticism that misses the point, since the grimness is precisely what the film is about, and the post-Soviet city it depicts is the horror, not merely its backdrop. Its weaknesses lie in a narrative resolution that does not fully deliver on the dread the preceding 70 minutes have constructed. But the atmosphere of Tin, its insistence on looking directly at the things that Russian horror so often approaches through metaphor, is the film's central and irreducible achievement. In our view, it belongs in this list without reservation. Number 11. Directed by Sergei Vinokurov. Upir, 1997. Adapted from Alexei Konstantinovich Tolstoy's foundational vampire story. Written in 1841 and among the earliest examples of the modern vampire narrative in world literature, Vinokurov's film arrives with a literary pedigree it honors more fully than its modest production suggests. A young man encounters a family of vampires and is drawn into a conflict that forces him to question everything he understands about the living and the dead and about the obligations that pass between them. The film occupies an interesting transitional position in Russian horror history. It belongs to the post-Soviet period in its production context, but to the pre-Soviet literary tradition in its material, and that dual inheritance gives it a quality that purely contemporary genre exercises lack. Its production values reflect the economic constraints of mid-90s Russian filmmaking, and certain technical elements have dated in ways that require adjustment on the part of modern viewers. But the source material is strong. Vinokurov respects it, and the film's understanding of the Russian vampire, different in crucial ways from the Western tradition the genre had by then globalized, is genuinely illuminating. In our view, Upir earns its place here as a bridge between Russia's horror literature and its horror cinema. Number 10, directed by Pavel Sidorov. Dawn, Rasvit, 2019. Sidorov's film makes a choice that immediately distinguishes it from the majority of contemporary Russian horror. It reaches back into the specific horrors of the Soviet period, the Great Patriotic War, the particular weight of that sacrifice, the things that came back from the front alongside the survivors, and builds its supernatural premise from that historical wound. A young psychiatrist is brought to a closed facility to evaluate a veteran whose experiences at the front have left him with something that conventional diagnosis cannot account for, and the film gradually reveals that what returned from the war with him is not metaphorical. The premise is rich. The historical grounding gives the supernatural elements a gravity they would lack in a purely contemporary setting, and Sidorov's direction manages the transition between the clinical and the supernatural with more craft than the film's limited release would suggest. The weaknesses are primarily structural. The second act loses some of the controlled tension the first establishes. But Dawn is a film that knows where Russian horror comes from, that the Great Patriotic War is a wound the culture has never closed, and it uses that knowledge with intelligence and restraint. Your votes placed it at 10. In our view, it belongs higher. Number 9, directed by Sviatoslav Podgaevsky. Yaga, Nightmare of the Dark Forest. Yaga, Koshmar Temного Lesa, 2020. Podgaevsky returns, his fourth appearance on this list, with the figure that sits at the very center of Slavic folkloric horror. Baba Yaga, the Witch of the Deep Forest, here transposed into a contemporary urban setting where a child's disappearance draws a family into contact with something older than the city that surrounds them. The urban reworking of folkloric horror is a strategy with variable results, and Yaga executes it with more conviction than most of its competitors in the Russian genre. Podgaevsky understands that what makes Baba Yaga frightening is not her appearance, but her function. She takes children, and she cannot be reasoned with. And the film's most effective sequences are those in which that function operates at its most implacable. Its weaknesses are familiar from his other work, a commercial orientation that occasionally smooths the rougher edges the material needs, and a resolution more legible than the atmosphere earned. But as a contemporary updating of one of horror's oldest and most specifically Slavic figures, Yaga succeeds where more timid productions have failed. The community placed it at 9, and Podgaevsky's consistent presence across this entire list tells its own story. Number 8, directed by Igor Baranov. Gogol, The Beginning. Gogol Nachalo, 2017. The most purely entertaining film in the upper half of this list, and the one most likely to convert viewers who are new to Russian horror into viewers who want more of it. Baranov's film, the first part of a trilogy originally produced as a television series and released theatrically in edited form, reimagines Nikolai Gogol as a young scribe and aspiring writer who accompanies a detective to the Ukrainian countryside and discovers both the source of his literary imagination and his capacity for supernatural perception. The film is knowing about its own cultural territory. Gogol wrote the stories that Baranov is now adapting, and placing Gogol himself at the center of their horror creates a reflexivity that rewards the attentive viewer while never demanding it. The performances, particularly Alexander Petrov as Gogol, who finds the character's volatility and sensitivity in equal measure, are stronger than the television-adjacent production context might suggest. Its weaknesses are those of a first episode. Certain threads are established rather than developed, and the film ends in the awareness that what follows will not be provided immediately. But as an opening, it is more than sufficient, and Baranov's second appearance on this list confirms his position as the most commercially instinctive director working in Russian genre cinema. In our view, Gogol, The Beginning deserves its position at 8. Number 7. Directed by Sviatoslav Podgayevsky. Queen of Spades. The Dark Rite, Pikovaya Dama, Chorny Obryad, 2015. The urban legend of the Queen of Spades, summoned by mirrors and candles, and a specific sequence of ritual words, is one of the most persistent pieces of Russian childhood folklore. And Podgayevsky's film is the most serious attempt to translate that legend into a feature-length horror that the Russian industry has produced. A group of teenagers perform the ritual and discover, to their lasting regret, that it works. And what follows is a methodical horror film that understands its material well enough to know that the Queen's power lies not in jump scares, but in inevitability. The film's commercial orientation occasionally works against the atmospheric severity the premise deserves. Certain sequences reach for an audience broader than the material strictly requires. But Podgayevsky's direction is more disciplined here than in some of his other work, and the central figure is rendered with a visual consistency that sustains the film's dread across its runtime. The performances from the young cast are more committed than the genre typically demands of its teenagers. In our view, Queen of Spades. The Dark Rite is among the best Podgayevsky films on this list, and given how many appear here, that is not a small distinction. Number 6. Directed by Sviatoslav Podgayevsky. The Bride, Nevesta, 2017. Podgayevsky's fifth and final appearance on this list is his most commercially successful, his most atmospherically consistent, and in our view, his finest achievement. A young woman travels to the countryside to meet her fiancé's family before their wedding and encounters a house with a history that the family has spent generations maintaining in silence. The film belongs to the haunted house tradition, but it roots that tradition in specifically Russian folkloric soil. The curse that runs through a family line, the bargain made with something inhuman, the bride as a figure of particular supernatural vulnerability in Slavic mythology. And the grounding gives the familiar mechanics a texture they would lack in a more generically Western context. Podgayevsky's visual grammar here is tighter and more purposeful than in his earlier films. The house is a genuinely frightening space. The dread accumulates with discipline, and the climax earns the atmosphere it has spent 90 minutes building. The production design is the best of any Podgayevsky production, and the lead performance carries the film's emotional logic without strain. Your votes placed it at number 6, and in our view, the community got this one right. It is the best Russian supernatural horror film of the 2010s, and it announces a filmmaker who had, by this point, fully understood his own strengths. Number 5, directed by Pavel Ruminov. Dead Daughters, Mертвые дочери, 2007. This is the film on this list that Russian horror has taken longest to fully understand, and the reassessment has been worth the wait. Ruminov's debut feature arrived at a moment when J-horror influence on Russian cinema was at its most visible. The shadow of Ringu and Juon lay over every young genre filmmaker with supernatural ambitions, and Dead Daughters was initially read as a domestic entry in that tradition, rather than the distinctly Russian work it actually is. The premise? 2 dead girls appear to those who hear their story, following them unseen for 3 days and killing anyone whose behavior they judge to be morally unacceptable, is genuinely original in its mechanics, and Ruminov develops those mechanics with a rigor that the genre rarely brings to its own rules. The film is shot in a desaturated, near-monochromatic palette that transforms Moscow into something barely recognizable as the city its inhabitants occupy. And that transformation is not merely atmospheric but argumentative. The dead daughters see a different world than the living, and Ruminov's camera moves between those registers with an assurance that a debut director has no business possessing. The supporting cast navigates the film's moral framework with conviction. In our view, Dead Daughters is the most formally original Russian horror film of its generation, and its position at 5 does not overstate its achievement. Number 4, directed by Igor Abramenko. Sputnik, 2020. Abramenko's debut feature is the most internationally visible Russian horror film of the last decade, and the visibility is deserved. Set in 1983 in the final years of the Soviet period, the film follows a military psychiatrist, played by Oksana Akinshina, who is brought to a classified facility to evaluate a cosmonaut who returned from orbit as the sole survivor of a mission. The official account does not accurately describe what the cosmonaut brought back with him, a parasitic creature that lives inside him and emerges at night, is the film's central horror. But Abramenko is more interested in what the facility intends to do with it than in the creature itself. Sputnik is a Cold War horror film in the tradition of the best science fiction of that era, less concerned with the monster than with the institutional forces willing to sacrifice human beings in order to study and weaponize it. Akinshina's performance is the film's anchor, a woman navigating a system that values the asset over the man it is destroying, making decisions under conditions of deliberate information control. The creature effects are practical and convincing. The period setting is achieved with care and without nostalgia. In our view, Sputnik is the best Russian horror film of the last 5 years, and its position at 4 reflects the community's accurate recognition of that achievement. Number 3. Directed by Oleg Teptsov. Mr. Designer, Gospodina Formitel, 1988. This is the film that most Western audiences have not seen and most need to, and its presence at number 3 on this list, placed there by the votes of a community that clearly knows its Russian horror, is one of the most gratifying outcomes of this entire ranking. Teptsov's film is set in the early years of the 20th century in St. Petersburg. A painter and theatrical designer of singular talent becomes obsessed with recreating, through his art, a woman of extraordinary beauty who died young. The film does not reveal immediately what the painter intends to do with that recreation, and the revelation when it comes is one of the more genuinely disturbing moments in Soviet-era genre cinema. Viktor Avalov plays the painter with a coiled, aristocratic intensity that the role demands, a man who has entered into a compact with something he cannot fully name, and who pursues his obsession with the single-mindedness that the film treats as both inspiration and damnation. The visual palette, amber light, deep shadow, the specific melancholy of fin de siècle Russian interiors, is the work of a director operating at the height of his powers on material he has found wholly worthy of them. The soundtrack, composed by Sergei Kuryokin, is among the finest in Russian film. In our view, Mr. Designer is a masterpiece of Soviet Gothic cinema, and the community was right to place it here. Number 2, directed by Konstantin Yershov and Georgy Kropatchev. V. 1967. The film that defined Russian horror as a genre, the first Soviet horror film of the sound era, the adaptation that established Gogol's Nightmare as the template against which every subsequent Russian supernatural film would be measured, and a work that remains more frightening than the vast majority of what followed it across the next 6 decades. Based on Gogol's story of the same name, the film follows Koma Brut, a seminary student selected by chance to perform 3 nights of prayers over the body of a dying witch, and what those 3 nights reveal about the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Leonid Kuravlyov plays Koma with a physical and psychological openness the role requires, a man who is not equipped for what is happening to him and who cannot leave. Yershov and Kropatchev work within the conventions of Soviet cinema and find within those conventions a genuine and enduring horror film. The final night in the church is as sustained a sequence of dread as anything in the international genre canon of the period. The practical effects, the flying coffin, the gathering of creatures, the Vi itself, were among the most technically demanding in Soviet film history and remain effective nearly 60 years later. Your votes placed it at number 2. In our view, the community was correct, and the film that earned the position above it did so narrowly. Number 1. Directed by Albert Makurchian. The Touch, Prikosnovenia, 1992. Your votes placed Albert Makurchian's The Touch at the summit of Russian horror, and the verdict demands both explanation and defense. Because this is a film that even committed fans of the genre encounter infrequently, and its position at number 1 will be the most discussed placement in this entire list. Released in 1992, in the first year of the Russian Federation's existence, the film occupies a historical threshold that its supernatural subject matter mirrors with uncomfortable precision. A world in which the old certainties have dissolved and something new, not yet named, not yet understood, has taken their place. McCurchin builds his horror from an idea that is deceptively simple. What does it mean to touch the dead, and what passes between the living and the dead in that contact? The film answers that question with a patience and a visual intelligence that the Soviet system he was trained in produced, and that the post-Soviet period was already beginning to dismantle. The performances are committed without being theatrical. The atmosphere is total and unrelenting, without resorting to the mechanics that lesser horror films depend on. The horror is not the kind that makes you flinch. It is the kind that makes you think about it later, in the dark, when you cannot find a satisfying explanation for what you felt. This is what Russian horror has always done best, and no film on this list does it better. Your picks. Number 1. That is your list. 20 films drawn from across the full history of Russian horror. From 1967 to 2023, from Soviet Gothic to contemporary psychological dread. The result of your votes is a ranking that reflects something genuine about what Russian horror means to those who love it. Tell us which placement you would overturn. The conversation in the comments is, as always, part of the list. Subscribe to Movie Blanket Club